back. We're back. We're back. We're back. We're back. We're back again. We're back. We're back. We're back. We're back. We're back. We're back again. Huh. Okay. What's going on, folks? What's going on, folks? It's your friendly neighborhood Professor Cag, swinging through the hallways, highways, and byways of a local YouTube room near you. And today's YouTube Live is for our English 226 African American Literature class. What's going on, folks? So glad to be back in the virtual Zoom Boom room with you all. I've got a couple of announcements to make before we dive right on into our YouTube live session. Now, this is the time and the space that we have for you all to drop questions in the chat, raise interesting observations, and to also interact with me on a live basis, folks. And I do indeed want to make sure that you all know that we're about to go live. We're all the way live. Sorry, that's an old school song. I'm an old school artist by the name of Coolio from back in the day. We've got a couple more minutes until we need to ultimately get started. Let me see here. Shift, how about that? Shift, no. Okay. There we go. Option. There we go. There we go. Okay. No, Guru. Yikes. There we go. Yes. Okay. Let me see that. Scroll right on over there. Excuse me. I wonder if what that'll do. Topic podcast feed. Huh. Okay. So I've sent out some messaging. All right, folks, let's go ahead on so we can get started on our new YouTube series. So every week, a couple of announcements that I want to actually make. First of all, welcome everybody. I am indeed your friendly neighborhood Professor Cax, swinging through the hallways, highways, and byways of a local Zoom room near you. Today, I want to take a different approach. As I mentioned at the beginning of this semester, at some point in time, our YouTube series are going to have to actually branch off and diverge into different streams. So this week is actually the first week that we'll have our African American literature course and the YouTube live that's associated with it. This is our first meeting together, our first virtual meeting. Okay. So if you're joining me right now, I certainly hope that you all are enjoying the class so far. Drop a message right on in the chat. Strawberry Leche, what's happening? How you doing? I'm so sorry. Heck, remind me of your name. The screen names and the YouTube names definitely throw me off. It's so good to see you. It's so good to see somebody in the chat right here. Welcome, Edeline. Edeline, very nice to see you. Very nice to see you. I'm just going to make a couple of announcements before we actually dive right on into our weekly YouTube session. So as I mentioned, this is actually the first in our new series. Our new YouTube live series will actually go, I'll be going live for our African American Lit class Fridays at 2 p.m. Fridays at 2 p.m. You can catch me early in the afternoon on your friendly neighborhood Professor Cag's YouTube channel. Today, I want to actually discuss a couple of things with you. If you can, join me in reviewing or follow along with me in our announcements. Let's see if I can actually share my screen here. Adeline, how you doing today? How is the semester going for you? Who else do I have here in the chat? Rough. Okay. Talk to me. Hopefully, maybe I can lighten the load a little bit. Is the semester going rough? Life is going rough, or is it a little bit of both? Because the world is a little unhinged right now at the moment. Okay. All right. Good. Glad to hear that you're getting better. Were you sick? A lot of people I know have actually been getting sick just because of the shift and the change in weather, and also too, it's starting to warm up just a little bit. But even before that, it was actually a little cold, and there was a couple of viruses, couple of strains that were floating around in the air. Oh no. Okay. Yeah. So it's got nothing to do with health, got everything to do with legals. Had to do some deep research. Okay. Hopefully, we're not solely relying on AI. Hopefully, we're not solely relying on AI. AI is a great tool, don't get me wrong, but hopefully, we're not solely relying on it. Anytime that you have any research concerns, I'm certainly a resource for you. Okay, there we go. Perfect. I love to hear that. I absolutely love to hear that. Great. So then you have everything that you need. Oh man. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yes. So anytime in terms of, research and things of that sort, gathering resources, trying to see, which kinds of databases we have access to as Cerritos College folk. I can certainly be a help for that. So let me know. Okay. Um, all right. So let's dive right on into it. Okay. So let's actually cover our updates and announcements for week 6. One, first and foremost, there's one announcement that I have to actually make all of you aware of if you're not already aware of it. Because if you don't know, you won't know. So let me go ahead on and inform you. Let me tell you, next week is spring break, folks. Next week is spring break. I know the tragedy, the sadness, dread, It seems like we just got off of a break. It seems like we just had a holiday. Don't worry if you feel like that, you're not crazy. Reason why is because the spring semester ends up having way more days where we don't have to come to school than the fall, right? So the springtime is actually the time that I don't know about other professors. I want to actually put them out there. However, myself, I look forward to more than anything because that means that I have more time to break up our instructional flow, which gives me more time to actually grade. Okay. So it's totally and personally for selfish reasons why I love spring break. Um, Second announcement. Let me actually dive right on into it. Okay. So your midterm exam is actually due March 29th. So that's the Sunday after we return from spring break. Um, and it will cover the readings, PowerPoints, and lectures and modules, all the content that's actually covered in the modules from weeks 1 through week 7. Okay. As I mentioned at the beginning of our YouTube live today, this is actually the first in a new series of YouTube lives that'll begin Fridays at 2 p.m. for our English 226 African American Literature course, for the duration of the rest of the semester. As I mentioned before, earlier in the semester, at a certain point, while at that time we were all together, right, all under one big roof, right, at a certain point we would have to actually diverge and break off into branch rooms, right, or to different branches of YouTubes, and that's exactly where we are right now at this point in the semester. Okay, so our new YouTube live series will indeed start and commence every Friday 2 p.m., um, unless otherwise posted on an announcement. Okay. Office hours this week are indeed over. They usually take place between Tuesday through Thursday. Um, Next week there will be no office hours because we will have spring break. We will be on spring break, so there won't be any office hours that'll be made available. However, the following week they will start back up starting Tuesday through Thursday. So please make sure to schedule an appointment with me, especially for those of you who've submitted your writing assignments, your textual analysis. I believe that the majority of you all in this class should have actually received, if you submitted your writing assignment, your textual analysis, formalist analysis of one of the slave narratives that was due not last week but the week before. You should have also too already received your essay back. If you haven't, just send me a message, and then because that means that I it got submitted after I finished grading. So all of you should have feedback, commentary, and a grade on your essays. Okay. So make sure to actually reach on out to me, so that way we can discuss a revision strategy if what you need to do is to actually revise. And what I've noticed is that a lot of you actually need to revise. Very few of you actually took the time out, or maybe it just kind of flew over your head for you all to actually read through some of the writing guidelines and submission format standards, right? So if you go to modules, the second entry, syllabus writing guidelines and formats, will actually I'll direct you to writing assignment submission guidelines. And every single essay that you submit should actually follow this format here. Y'all, in an English 226, I didn't think that this here actually needed to be stated. However, it does, certainly because of based on the evidence that I've actually received from a lot of my students and their headings, it does need to be stated. Your paper needs to be in MLA format. Every single paper that we submit in this class needs to be in MLA format, and more particularly, it needs to actually reflect this format that you see right here, where you have a header in the upper right-hand corner, including your last name and the page number, a heading, including your name, professor name, class, and section number, right, along with the date in International Standard or Ascending Order, okay? Every single paper needs a title. The title of the assignment is not the title, okay? That is the title of the assignment. You need to include an actual title that reflects the central idea or thesis of your paper. All titles do a certain kind of job. They do a certain type of work. And when you don't have one, right, then it ends up actually creating a little bit of a disconnect between the central idea and the reader. All right. Every single paper that includes a new paragraph should indeed have an indent of 0.5 inches or one tab space. You need to also to not indent the entire paragraph, but rather you need to allow the text to wrap around the page. And every single essay should indeed be double spaced, not triple, not quadruple space. You shouldn't have any extra spaces in between the heading and the title, in between the title and the first sentence or the first line of the paragraph in the intro. No, double spaced, Times New Roman, 12-point font all the way throughout. Okay. And again, if you need any help, please make sure to schedule an office hours appointment with me so that way we could actually review it and go over it. All right. Okay. So I am not expecting to see this same mistake on any papers moving forward. If I do, I will certainly promptly return your paper back to you with a needs revision. Okay. And the grade that you will have in the books will be a 0 because this here is a basic element of writing, especially at the literature class, that should be addressed and included as part of the basic formatting for all essays, all writing assignments moving forward. Okay. All right, folks. Now, let me actually dive right on into our readings. Double check there. If you have any questions, please definitely include them in the chat. Any questions, comments, concerns, emotionally justifiable outbursts, all of those things there are acceptable. Okay, so make sure to actually include them in the chat. All right. Frequently, I'm switching between windows, tabs, and screens. So if you just drop the comment or question in the chat, I will eventually see it. Let me know if you cannot see my screen at any point in time as I'm switching through or toggling through tabs and windows, because I'll kind of check back frequently to see, just to make sure that I'm that you all are still with me. Okay, so let's take a look here. I want to take a look at course module 5 and course module 6. Now, if you notice here, course module 6 is pretty thick, and you'll see not the reading being repeated, but rather an exercise, right? That is from course module 5, or that references a reading from course module 5. You'll see it included in course module 6. And that exercise is an assignment in regards to Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery readings that are listed in our course schedule. Okay, the text that you actually see, the PDF from Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, should indeed include all of the pieces that we need for this reading. And here I'm only asking that you all actually read. Let's go to the table of content. Here I'm really only asking for you all to actually read chapters 1 through 3, and then chapter 14. Okay. Which is the Atlanta Exposition Address. Okay, that's the one that chapter 14, the Atlanta Exposition Address, is the one where he actually calls for Black folks coming out of the South who are leaving the South in droves during the time of the Great Migration after the passage of the 13th Amendment, which at least nominally called for an end to legal enslavement with very few exceptions. He calls for Black folks to cast down their buckets where they're at. Do not leave the South. Black folks are leaving in droves, coming out of the South, moving into the East, moving into the Mid-Atlantic, moving into the Midwest, moving out West, right? Into areas and urban enclaves where job opportunities were plentiful, right? Particularly among the industry, okay? In this Atlantic Compromise, or what was kind of colloquially known as the Atlanta Compromise or the Atlanta Exposition Address, here he makes, Booker T. Washington makes clear his philosophy of accommodationism, right? and which did not settle well among Black folks, especially Black folks who were fed up with the historical and longstanding social practice of white supremacy, right? That social practice of white supremacy was certainly bolstered and supported, reinforced by a juridical practice and instantiation of white supremacy, oftentimes which took place or which took shape in the form of literacy tests, poll taxes, and also armed guards, not who were state sanctioned necessarily or direct agents of the state, but rather who were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Uh, so white civic organizations that were uh, either 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 informally or informally sanctioned, right, by the local sheriff or the local municipal law enforcement offices, or even at the state level, right, or and oftentimes many of whom, right, you would find your sheriffs or deputies or local law enforcement who are also a part of the Ku Klux Klan, or who engaged in membership to some degree or another. And so to that extent, right, it was rather um, not formally sanctioned, but rather informally sanctioned, state sanctioned white civic organizations that formed a security militia um, under the guise and the auspices of protecting the vote, right, and ensuring political authenticity of the voters, making sure that nobody voted illegally. That should sound very familiar, especially when we think about the legislation that's being put forth at Congress currently for the SAVE plan, right? Nonetheless, Booker T. Washington is delivering this address, the Atlanta Compromise speech, during this time in this and in this moment, this historical moment where Black folks find themselves more than ever before being pushed out of the South in droves, in fact. And interestingly enough, there is a response, which we actually get to see in this week's readings in The Influence of the Spirituals by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, what most people don't actually understand, or at least what's not popularly remembered here, is that in between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington exists a friendship, right? At the very least, an acquaintanceship, at most, right? Um, a kind of admiration, right? Where Du Bois looking up to, or rather seeing the progress and substantive movement that Booker T. Washington is able to make, you know, going from a teacher, right, an instructor, to establishing his own um, institution, right, for Black teachers, right, and really taking up excuse me, and really admiring his own um, what we would call today, right, his his approach to independence, right? If we think about this, if we're drawing on terminology that informs uh, the approach that many YouTubers actually take, right, to promoting their own artistry, right? Booker T. Washington is your what by today's standards what will be considered to be, right, your DIY, not DEI, right, but your DIY, your do it yourself, right? Get it out of the mud. Not so much even necessarily, right, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, although that's kind of part of his legacy, certainly, right, without a doubt. But rather, right, he was somebody who was interested in, okay, well, first of all, right, this Black man who was actually born into slavery, right, whose father was indeed, he did not know, but whose father, right, was, when I say that he didn't know, right, he never met him, right, but rather he was half white, half Black, right. His father was indeed suspected to be his slave master, right, his former slave owner, right. He moved along with his brother and his sister out of bondage and into freedom, right. He, as an individual who was born into slavery, right, um, would rather instead of trying to make the claim, right, that black folks need to just quite simply, right, instead of only making the claim, right, that black folks need to just quite simply pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right. And again, I want to be very careful and also quite transparent here, right. He has said more or less, right. But here's the thing with Booker T. Washington, one has to actually be aware, and this is part of what I want to actually highlight for us today. I'm gonna in the lecture, I want to actually provide some context surrounding both of these readings here, right? The Atlanta Compromise, and then also to Du Bois's response from Chapter 3 in The Souls of Black Folks. Um, Booker T. Washington is somebody who would, while he would make the claim, right, that black folks need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right, cast their buckets down, so on and so forth. He's not somebody who would only talk. You have to understand, Booker T. Washington is going to actually say that, and at the same time, gather funding so that way he could create a factory that produces shoes that employs black folks and that markets those shoes towards black folks too as well, because he very sophisticatedly understands at least one core tenet and central fact, right, of life at this particular time. Not all black folks, right? While you can make the claim, right, to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right, which is also too like a kind of phrase, an adage, a trope from rugged individualism, which was certainly right pronounced, professed, and also made popular by Teddy Roosevelt, right? Rugged individualism, right? While that was the popular phrase of the day, much like YOLO was back in the day, right? While Washington recognizes that you could say this, right, and that he has himself, right, said this, he also recognizes the central fact of life that not all black folks had access to shoes, and not all black folks even have clothing, right? Why? Especially because coming out of, transitioning out of, right, the end of the Civil War, transitioning out of the peculiar institution of slavery, right? Booker T. Washington recognizes that not all black folks had shoes or straps that were attached to boots to pull up. Are you with me? All right. Booker T. Washington very sophisticatedly recognizes this. And in fact, both he and Du Bois, while in public, right, seem to kind of have this battle, this ideological battle, right? This battle of wits, this battle of approaches, this battle of ideologies. They also, too, shared a very common mentor in the form of Carter G. Woodson. It's March 13th, folks. All of you should have actually at least heard of Carter G. Woodson. All of you should be familiar with Carter G. Woodson, if for no other reason than because, given the fact that it's March, meaning that we just spun off the heels of Black History Month, do any of you all know how it started? You know who started it? That's Carter G. Woodson, historian, right? One of the second black men to actually get his PhD from Harvard. He got it at a later date. Carter G. Woodson started Black History Month with Negro History Week, and it ended up actually developing, exploding, expanding into an entire month. Both he, W.B. Du Bois, and also to Booker T. Washington, shared a mutual admiration for Carter G. Woodson, right? And so, to that degree and extent, there's a deeper relationship that I don't think is actually put forth in the public's eye as much and as clearly as the relation, their tension, right, between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. There's even a poem, right, a very famous poem, right. It seems to me, says WB, right, WB versus Booker T, right. If I can find, let me see if I can find this. Let me find. This is the significance of research, folks. Right. This is why research is so cool. Like when you actually hit the archives. There we go. There we go. So this is interesting. Let me stop sharing here. Share something new with y'all. Here's a letter right here. This letter is from W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay. William Edmund Burghardt Du Bois. Right. Okay. Right. What does it say? My dear Mr. Washington, let me heartily congratulate you upon your phenomenal, what does that say? Upon your phenomenal success at Atlanta. He's speaking about the Atlanta Compromise, right? Let me heartily congratulate you on your success at Atlanta. It was a word fitly spoken. Sincerely yours, William Edmund Burghardt Du Bois. Look here. Where is he? He's at Wilberforce, September 24th. What year is this? 95. He's not talking about 1995. He's not talking about 1995. What year? Go back and look right now. Go. What year was the Atlanta Compromise delivered? What year was it published? Go back and look. Drop it in the chat for me, folks. Drop it in the chat for me, folks. Okay, right? This is the power of research. This here is what's so significant about hitting the archives and excavating some of the deeper letters, writings, personal notes, so on and so forth, that many of the folks within our African-American literary rhetorical tradition, this is what's so significant about, boom, there you go. That's what I'm talking about, Miss Adeline, right? 1895. What year is Du Bois writing this letter here in? He's writing it in September 24th, 1895, right? See? This is what's so significant about hitting the archives, right? And doing that research. So if Du Bois is, this is Du Bois's direct response. This is Du Bois' direct response to Mr. Booker T. Washington himself. My dear, indication of friendship. At least, at the very least, admiration. At the very least, admiration, right? Okay, right. The reason why I'm like so excited and juiced about this is because popular memory revises this entire relationship in such a way that we don't even conceptualize Du Bois being friends or having let alone admiration for Mr. Washington, for Booker T. We see and remember, popular memory, right? Remembers these two as being like Kendrick and Drake, right? Kendrick, of course, arguably, maybe, right? Being read, seen, observed through this lens of a kind of Kendrick Lamar lens, right? With the layer of cultural authenticity that's tied to the liberation of Black folks, right? Somehow, some way, right? We seem to divorce Booker T. Washington in popular memory away from this kind of cultural authenticity, and also too from the having a connection to Black folks and their liberation. We seem to somehow kind of divorce the two, right, when it comes to Booker T. Washington, and then we slap a label on him, right, as sellout. And I understand, right, to some degree or another, because it was a war of positions, a war of ideology, right, an ideological debate, okay, right. But the popular memory completely revises and reshapes this relationship. This letter demonstrates not only was there at the very least a kind of admiration between the two, but rather that they knew each other. Come on now, and that they had a friendly correspondence between the two of them, right? So when we see, right, the Atlanta Compromise and the response that Du Bois ends up actually writing to Booker T. Washington, which pops up in chapter 3 of The Souls of Black Folk, right? And his response to the Atlanta Compromise, right? It's very easy. Very easy. to imagine that these two didn't like each other, right? That it was Biggie and Tupac, that it was Biggie versus Tupac, right? Martin versus Malcolm, right? That it was, see, but even understand how it is that the people who I'm actually using to exemplify the relationship, right? That supports, or that just quite simply reflects the memory, the way that we talk about these individuals, right? Each one of those folks, right? Kendrick and Drake, right? Biggie and Tupac, right? Malcolm and Martin, right? All of these folks had a relationship with each other that popular memory seems to elide or ignore, pretend like it did not actually exist, when nothing could be further from the truth. Let's dive on. Let's move on. Right. In other words, what I want to highlight here for you all is that we need to engage in the act of critical reading, right? And also, too, doing research surrounding the readings, right? We need to actually read the scholarship around these primary texts that we have in order to truly understand, not truly understand, but in order to gain a deeper picture, in order to complicate the picture, right? That is solely presented through the primary texts, or even solely presented through a popular memory, right? Of these individuals. Okay. All right. And so it's in that spirit and vein that today I want to actually go over a historical PowerPoint presentation for you all, right? You all had to, for week 6, right, read, view, and take notes on a couple of PowerPoints. There were 3 that I posted up in particular that kind of highlight different aspects of the role of Negro spirituals and the significance of Negro spirituals um, in relationship to modern day African American expressive culture, right? Alongside of, or vis-a-vis, the blues, right? There are 3 PowerPoints that I've already kind of worked on and posted up for you all there. But what I did not actually post up was the history or the context in which the Negro spirituals evolution towards the blues, ultimately rap music, is occurring. That's what I want to go over today. Take a look with me. I want to cover some of the important historical elements of this particular moment, right? That's surrounding the construction, the composition of both the Atlanta Compromise and also to Du Bois's Chapter 3, right, of Mr. Booker T, right, and others. I want to provide some historical context there, and if you haven't kind of got wind of it by now, right, these 2 readings, right, weeks from course module 5 and primary reading from course module 5 and primary reading from course module 6 should be read in conversation, right, with each other, right? So you have the Atlanta Compromise, right? That's the first track, right? To some degree or another, right? That is and what was the first track? Hey, big is the what, right? From Drake and J. Cole, right? That's the where J. Cole actually mentions, right? Heck, it's the big 3, right? And then you have Chapter 3 from W.B. Du Bois, right, which is like that, right? Which is the response to, right? So, okay, right. So those 2 should be read, right, in conversation with each other. Okay. Let's dive right on in. Reconstruction and the Great Migration. Okay, folks, this you definitely want to take notes on, okay, because this is not actually available on our Canvas. Okay. There's a central question that becomes clear once we kind of unpack and trudge our way through, excavate the history surrounding life in the U.S. after the end of the Civil War. Okay, so walk with me. Largely speaking, Okay, right? The Civil War ended April 9th, 1865. And largely speaking, there is one central question that the nation is actually faced with at this particular time. That first, excuse me, the most central question that the nation is faced with at this time is, what do we do with at least a name only, right? A nominally free Black population, right? What do we do with a nominally free Black population, right? This is the question that the nation is faced with immediately upon the end of the Civil War, right, with the passage and ratification of the 13th Amendment. There existed a period just after the Civil War from 1865 through 1877, which is known as the period of Reconstruction, right, where the South, from Virginia all the way down through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, right, Louisiana, and also two parts of Texas, right, are undergoing a reconstruction. Okay, right. You could also consider Tennessee to be as well, right, in that mix, right. Each one, although this is a map of the military districts of the Confederacy, there wasn't a military district in either Texas, Louisiana, or excuse me, sorry, uh, in Tennessee, right? There were military districts. There was actually one military district that stretched across Texas and Louisiana, Military District Number 5, from the Confederate Army, right? um, and what we can actually see right along underneath the state, the name of the state, the dates that exist underneath there, right? So Virginia 1870, North Carolina 1868, South Carolina 1868, Georgia 1870, Florida 1868, Alabama 1868, 1870, 1868, 68, 70, right? These are all the dates in which these southern states, which had originally seceded, right, meaning that they had separated themselves from the Union, these are the dates that they were actually readmitted back into the Union. Okay, and even though this was not a part of a military district, Tennessee had also seceded too as well, which was considered to be a Confederate state, right? And it had rejoined first before any of the other ones in 1866. Okay, right? So the period, otherwise from 1865 through 1877, was a period known as Reconstruction, in which, right, military forces from the North came down south and instantiated or watched over the rebalancing, right, the reconstruction of the South, right, the reconstruction of buildings, especially state buildings, right, and municipalities, and also too they had watched over Union troops from the North, right? The transition of property from slave owners to their formerly enslaved folks, right? Now, this wasn't a wholesale just write off, right? Okay, hey, so everybody now who was once enslaved now has access to property. No, 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 no. No, these here were slave owners who had ended up actually by, and through a variety of different ways, these were slave owners who had lost their property, right? Either because they ended up actually going broke because their slaves left. Okay, right. So they therefore, right, had no more means, right, to sustain or to satisfy their debts, and they therefore, right, lost their property, right. And Black folks who had, right, through the acquisition of through their labor, right, acquired funds and money to purchase, right, these formerly enslaved places, right. Uh, Union troops from the North had to make sure that these Black folks, right, formerly enslaved folks, had access to their property, right, that they had just recently acquired and purchased, right. So there was no wholesale giving away, right, of land. These were slave folks, slave masters who had lost their property as a result of losing their slaves and losing the war, therefore, right, and Black folks actually having to come and repurchase it. Okay. Slaves are free. Slaves are freed not as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, oftentimes, right, and even if I'm not mistaken, even in Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise, or rather, excuse me, sorry, uh, uh, in his autobiography, which really should be called his biography, because he had a ghostwriter. There's another Drake reference or connection. He had a ghostwriter actually help him rewrite that. Um, Even though folks like Mr. Washington and others um, associate the freedom of slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, part of the motivation, even behind this association between the two, is more so meant to because of the popularity of that speech, the Emancipation Proclamation, right? When in reality, right, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified December 6th, 1865, that's precisely what ended slavery, right? That's when at the federal level, right across the union, right, slavery was outlawed, with one particular exception. If anybody here goes directly to, you can pull up the Constitution through a simple Google search, and you'll see that there's a subordinating clause that grants exception to the legality of enslavement, or rather the condition of in which enslavement could be considered to be legal, right, or rather accepted, and that is with the exception of under the condition of being incarcerated, right, or having been duly convicted of a crime, right? In that particular situation, under that condition, under the condition of crime and criminality, right, slavery is still legal here in the United States, which is precisely how it should be remembered. Slavery is still legal in the United States under the condition of crime and criminality, right, of an individual being duly convicted of a crime and or criminality. Okay, right. So the idea even of Black folks being freed, right, Black Independence Day largely recognized more recently um, by the nation as a whole on Juneteenth, right? June 19th, 1865, came as a result of that being the date in which Black folks in Texas, which is the furthest west territory in the Confederacy, or at least in some cases, right? It was kind of a contested territory, as far west, right, as far away from the capital as the Confederate states could possibly be, right. The furthest state west was Texas, right. So the news of slavery being over and ended traveled to Texas by June 19th, which was a full 6 months after the time, or rather almost about 6 months, about 5.5 months after the 13th Amendment had actually passed through Congress. Right. It was ratified and took effect on December 6th, 1865. What we also have is the passage of the 14th Amendment, right? Okay, now these are three important historical artifacts, right? Laws that we have to take note of, right? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, right? 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people who were born and naturalized within the United States, with the exception of indigenous Americans, right? Otherwise, I think what's listed right is Indians. That was passed June 13th, 1866, almost a year later, a year after Juneteenth. Okay. 15th Amendment passed in 1870, ratified rather in 1870. 15th Amendment gave African American men, not women, the right to vote. And that was a very intentional choice here, especially at this time, because what was part of the popular perception, right? Um, and it wasn't just only men who actually kind of held this perspective, right? There were women too as well. Um, uh, there were women who also who held that perspective, right? But it's a little bit of a it's more complicated than just it quite being a matter of, both men and women upheld this view that women should not have the right to vote. Okay, it's a lot more complicated than that. Meaning that it's actually kind of better to use a different, I think, metaphor to describe um, the context surrounding, right, both men and women upholding the view that women should not be given the right to vote, but rather it should be granted to men and men exclusively, right? Uh, the metaphor here that I would like to actually use is the metaphor of sunglasses, right? So if you've ever used a pair of sunglasses that help you, like blue blockers, especially right back in the day, was these things called blue blockers, right? Sunglasses that actually help to keep the sun out, right? Help to keep, or tamp down, right, the UV rays or glares and things like that, right? Polarized lenses and things of that sort, right? Those glasses there, to some degree or another, change the way that you actually view the world, right? Change the ways that you view yourself, right? The lens through which you actually view yourself, right? Throughout the world, right? The entire world looks a shade darker, right? People who held on to the ideology and belief that that voting should be the exclusive right and territory, the privilege of men, right? Were folks who kept their glasses on rather than taking them off once they got inside the house. You ever try to wear your shades when you got inside the house? You ever recognize how hard it was actually, how hard it was to look to see like the details of images, right? You ever did that? I used to do that, right? I used to try to wear my sunglasses at night, right? I used to try to wear them inside the house, and I couldn't really see, right? That's perhaps a more apt metaphor to describing what's meant by the observation that both men and women kind of held on to the view that voting should be the exclusive right and privilege of men. It did not actually make any rational sense. It did not help the individuals who were laboring under such an illusion to see better. Holding on to that belief, that ideology, did not help to progress, right, voting or the political health and vitality of the nation at all, right? But rather, it just quite simply dimmed their view, right, into a form of myopathy, right, where it kind of distorted their view, okay, of themselves and the world around them. So the passage of the 15th Amendment certainly granted the right to vote for African American men. Later, it would actually be granted to women, not through the passage of either the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment, but it would not come until quite some time later. In fact, about almost 40 years later. Um, Interestingly enough, throughout the South, those areas, those states that I kind of mentioned to y'all just a second ago, right? Um, During slavery, so before the end of the Civil War, throughout the South, there were certain codes that were protected by the law and by law enforcement. Codes by which Black folks, enslaved folks, African descendants were required to conduct themselves within. Those codes were called slave codes. Okay. Those slave codes, fast forward, right, upon the end of the Civil War, were modified, particularly throughout this period of Reconstruction. In fact, just after the end of Reconstruction, there was reinstantiated those slave codes and they were modified. This is the reason why, right? One of many reasons why, for individuals who uphold the belief that slavery that was practiced historically is the same as slavery that was practiced for the better part of 300 years, particularly in the North American territories and also to Central and South America, right? That the kind of slavery that was practiced during the transatlantic slave trade, this is an example or one of the reasons why that's not sound reasoning or logic. They're not the same. Okay. Why? Because throughout the global practice, right, the historical global practice of enslavement, usually prisoners of war, members of a rival tribe, right, who were captured as a result of war, right? People who were moved around, right? Prisoners of war again, right? Taken from like Morocco, right? Was present day Morocco, right? To Italy, right? To Rome, right? Why you see black folks in Rome to some degree or another, right? Who were part of the gladiators. Right? Those folks had the opportunity to become a part of the culture that they were enslaved to. And also, too, right? The slavery only lasted for a particular kind of term. It was not generational. Sorry, folks. It was not generational, right? Like, if they had a child with somebody who was a part of their enslaver culture, that child would therefore be a member, a citizen, have full rights and access to citizenship, right, of the enslaver culture. With racial chattel slavery that was practiced throughout the transatlantic slave trade, that was never the case. That was not the case. It was for a period of time, and then they immediately stopped it and started instituting laws that were based almost exclusively on racial identity alone. This is one example of it, right? The legacy of that practice, right? The legacy of that legal practice. You see, the slave codes, which were enacted and instantiated throughout the period of enslavement, right, were reintroduced after the end, after 1877, at the end of Reconstruction, once the Northern troops were recalled back to the North. And what took its place were what were known as Black codes, right? Okay. So Black codes were laws that were passed by Southern states that limited the newfound freedom of African Americans, particularly, right, sharecropping laws, right, which were morphed into a kind or type of profession that mirrored the very same practices of enslavement, right? It limited Black folks' ability to civically organize, right? Sort of form things like unions, to form political action networks or political action groups, right? It limited Black folks' institutional and social responses, right? It made it illegal for them to actually get together, right? Not only were did Black codes limit the social movement and mobility of Black folks, it also limited the political mobility and the political organizing, the political galvanization, right, of Black folks, right? So what was also too a part of Black codes were a new set of codes that had enforced a set of voting rights, right? Things like the poll tax, right? Things like the grandfather clause, which stated that if your grandfather could not vote, right, then you can't either, right? Literacy tests, right? If you cannot pass this test, then you cannot vote, okay, right? And if you cannot pay, right, this fee, then you cannot vote. Right alongside of the reinstantiation of Black codes, you also had almost immediately after, not even 20 days after the successful ratification of the 13th Amendment, uh, the kind of nominal and legal end, right, to slavery, you had the formation of the Ku Klux Klan by Nathan Forrest, right, who was a former Confederate general, former Confederate soldier, who gathered up other former Confederate soldiers in an effort to reestablish social order, right? Uh, to reestablish law and order in the South, right? That was the language and the guise through which their civic organization, otherwise known as the Ku Klux Klan, right, was actually formed under, but rather the coded language, right, the coded message that existed underneath those lines, right, of reestablishing the social order, right, translated to right, reestablishing white supremacy. 1865, a group of white Southerners in Pulaski, Tennessee, created the Ku Klux Klan, where they were dressed in white robes, hoods, and engaged in the regular practices of lynching. Right, and this was a white Christian civic organization. Right, part of the ideas behind their dress in hoods and burning crosses and dressing in predominantly white robes for the membership, right? Colored robes for various ranking members of leadership throughout the organization, drew in large part back to pagan practices of Christianity, right? Kind of a kind of pagan hybrid of Christianity um, back in uh, uh, back in Europe. Okay, right. Needless to say, voting restrictions, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and the reinstantiation and development, right, of into black codes, right, created a set of factors, conditions that at once pushed black folks out of the South, and because of the economic opportunities, right, the proximity and distance away from right this kind of repressive regime of white supremacy in the North, right, kind of created a set of factors and conditions that pulled black folks out of the South, which leads to what historians and scholars call the Great Migration, right? The second Great Migration of black folks. Okay. Some of those push factors, as we mentioned, right, was racial violence, right, the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, right, the assault, the blanket impunity, right, that white civic organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan, including right the Knights of Columbus, including white sharecroppers, right, and the rise of lynching, right, in addition to right economic repression, right, tenant farming, right, meaning that right they worked to live, right, where black folks worked to live, right, they would not get a wage outside of them having right a place to actually live, right? Boycotts, intimidation, political repression, particularly of the black codes and sundown towns, and also to vagrancy laws, right? In fact, right, slavery by another name. In fact, if you remember back 2 weeks ago, I had you all watch a documentary entitled Slavery by Another Name. There was an episode, at least the first episode, which kind of characterizes and historicizes the move that white Southerners began to engage in mass, right, as a way to reestablish social order, right, a white dominant social order within and across the South, otherwise known as vagrancy laws, right? White Southern municipalities and towns began to pass vagrancy laws. They began to pass laws for loitering, right, where black folks could be arrested for the most trivial of offenses. Right? They didn't even have to actually commit an offense, right? All they would have to do is just quite simply successfully convince a judge and then say, "Hey, that person right there did this." Right? Boom, black folks go to jail. Guess what? They're right back under the condition. They're situated right back under the condition of enslavement. All because of that subordinate clause in the 13th Amendment, which provides an exception, which grants an exception to the one condition that makes slavery still that retains its legality, and that's under the condition that they have been duly convicted of crime. Right. In addition to all these social and political factors, you also have the environmental factors, which is otherwise known as the boll weevil infestation, right, throughout the South, which completely mangled crops in the early 1900s, right? Volatile weather, right? The Dust Bowl, anybody who's read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck certainly understands, or at least has read a bit, a fraction, a part of the story that talks about the drought that actually consumed most of America's farmland, right? Which also too pushed folks to the urban cities where industry was made available, right? And in those towns in the north of the South, that is, right, throughout the Mid-Atlantic, right? So here we're talking about Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, right? We're talking about excuse me, sorry, we're talking about Pennsylvania, we're talking about Ohio, we're talking about Michigan, we're talking about Illinois, right? We're talking about, right, those towns that are in industry, right? Boston, um, um, Washington, right? We're talking about the Midwest, right? Iowa, Dakota, right? North Dakota, Montana, right? We're talking about out west, right? California, especially Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, right? These are all places that are booming with economic opportunity, and also too where populations of Black folks from out of the South are forming new communities in mass. These created certain pull or attraction factors that pulled, not pushed, rather, but invited Black folks to consider, well, maybe we should actually leave the South because, there were push factors that they were recognizing, right? Rise of the Ku Klux Klan, right? The passage of Black codes, right? White folks accusing Black folks of random crimes, whether they did it or not, and having their relatives disappeared, right? Never to be seen or heard from again. If anybody in here has ever seen the movie Life, Eddie Murphy, Martin Lawrence, you've seen slavery by another name in action. That's precisely what that movie was actually based on. That's exactly what the primary social issue of that movie, that was at stake in that film. That was a film about the passage, that was a film about the effects of vagrancy laws and peonage slavery, right? Slavery by another name. At the same time, right, you have a bunch of attractive factors. You have to understand, right? Black folks looking at this and they're like, oh my gosh, that's not cute. You know what? I'm gonna do better outside. So as a variety, right? There's a variety of different things that are kind of attracting Black folks to the Mid Atlantic, to the Midwest, right, out west. Not the least of which is economic opportunity, right? With the real big question behind it. Certain places they could certainly find access to jobs in industry. Any place where they found access to jobs, especially in industry, it was met with racial tension and also to a severe racial backlash, right? Particularly by and amongst white folks. And yes, by this time, Irish, Italian, even Jewish folks are considered to be, and Eastern Europeans, right, are considered to be white based on the census, right? So it's interesting because polls, right, so on and so forth, right? Because in these, especially in the Mid-Atlantic areas, right, the industry, where industry is rooted heavily, right, steel, right, you have a bunch of folks who see these Black people coming out of the South and they think they're going to take our jobs. It immediately erupts in a variety of instances and moments of severe racial backlash. While Black folks were no longer subjected to the racial violence of the South that's committed through the Ku Klux Klan, they were certainly made vulnerable to it, right, and exposed to racial violence of white folks in the North. And that was an altogether different kind of beast than the Ku Klux Klan, right? The Wilmington Massacre of 1898, right? What they call the Red Summer, right? Where racial violence and racial riots erupted across the Mid-Atlantic East Coast and also two parts of the Midwest, right? Red Summer, 1919, right? These are all moments in which racial violence kind of came to a head, and where you have white folks who were rioting, right, who were initiating a violent, racist, vitriolic backlash against Black folks who they perceive as taking their jobs. At the same time, you have opportunities and moments for unity, racial unity, and solidarity, right? Even hope, mystery, adventure, myths, all of which are actually exemplified in the form or come to a head, right? In the form after the racial racist riots, right, of Red Summer 1919, right, the Wilmington Massacre, right, in North Carolina, right, 1898, right, the Massacre of Rosewood, 1920, right, the Massacre of Tulsa, 1929, right. At this time here, right, you actually have from a period of about 1918 through 1925, right, a unique moment and blend of opportunity, right, and imagination and mystery, otherwise known as the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro Movement. Okay, all right, but we'll talk about that next week. That's when we get into the Harlem Renaissance. That's when we get into Langston Hughes, Roy Neal Hurston, right? So many others, County Cullen, right? So on and so forth. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But where did Black folks go? Primarily Chicago, Detroit, New York, St. Louis, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, right? These places and more, also to Archie Lee, right? Biddy Mason, right? Coming out west, right? Biddy Mason establishing the first first African American Methodist Episcopal Church. Sorry, I had to say that very slowly. That was certainly some of the most notable features, right, of Black folks who ended up making their way out south, excuse me, from the South out west, right? So Black folks went all over the United States, right? Pivoting off the heels of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, right, and the reinstantiation of white supremacy throughout the South. It's interesting because one has to actually think and consider the historical context, the movements, the push and the pull factors. When reading Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise, understand that he was speaking directly in response to those push and pull factors. Similarly, one has to consider the push and pull factors, right? The passage of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment and Du Bois's response to the Atlanta Compromise. Understand that Black folks, right now, while the nation is actually faced with this central question at this time, right? Nationally, right? What do we do with at least a nominally free Black population, right? Black folks were concerned with this central question. While the nation was concerned with that question, right? What do we do with a bunch of free Black folks, right? Black folks were concerned with this question. Which path, which way, which approach, which path will best lead to Black folks' liberation, to the continued project and legacy of liberation? Which path is the best route for Black folks to take to achieve and sustain liberation? Is it the path of compromise? Where we compromise with the push factors of racial violence against Black folks and Black communities, right? While simultaneously acquiescing, holding our heads down, right? Building or trying to build a business, right? And in hopes of gaining economic independence? Is that the best route for us to take? Or is the best route for us to take involve the pursuit of education? Where we could gain not only the credentials, but also to influence socially and politically to become leaders and movers and shakers amongst the different positions in industry. Which route is the best route for Black folks to take? The path of compromise in industry or the path of the liberal education? Ultimately, those are the two positions that are those are the two ideological positions that are being debated back and forth between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Ultimately, that question shapes the various epochs and literary movements within the African American rhetorical tradition from that point forward, at least all the way up until we actually get to hip hop, where the next question actually evolves and the conditions uh, of the subjects of Black folks end up actually shifting. But we'll discuss more of that later on, folks, as we continue on with our weekly YouTube sessions. Thank y'all so much. I ran a little bit over time. Check this out. Hey, if you want to actually find out more information about some of the stuff, especially the historical context surrounding the Atlanta Compromise and also to Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, Chapter 3, Out of the Souls of Black Folks from W.E.B. Du Bois, then please definitely go directly to this website entitled blackpast.org dash online. It's an online, excuse me, blackpast.org. It's an online encyclopedia which collects nearly 300 major speeches, 140 full text primary documents, timelines, bibliographies, digital archives, so on and so forth, online magazines. This here is one of the best resources, that most comprehensive, best in the sense of it being one of the most comprehensive resources that you can certainly find on the African American rhetorical tradition online and on the web. Okay, if you have any resources that you've come across, please don't hesitate to send those out to me. Just because I'm the professor doesn't mean I'm a know-it-all. Okay, it just means that I'm a nerd and that I've spent way too much time actually studying and reading these things. And it also means that I can learn. Okay, it means that I can learn. So if you discover some stuff that I don't have, I want to learn from you. So definitely shoot me a text on Slack, send me a message in the inbox on Canvas, shoot me a message in the chat even. Okay, folks, and make sure that you tap in with me, teach me as I teach you, so that way we can teach each other and make ourselves better. Okay. All right, folks, thank you so much. This here has been your friendly neighborhood Professor Cag, swinging through the hallways, highways, and byways. I want you all to, as you move through next week, enjoy your spring break. Go out on a date. Go out to the beach. Be careful about getting in the water, but just go and enjoy yourself. Have some fun in the sun because it's going to be a hot one, okay? Enjoy yourselves. Take care of yourselves and also take care of each other. Peace.